author Kay Wally. Costumes are encouraged. And then finally, research rundown, which will be on Monday, November 7th. It's a virtual online program at noon Central Time. And it's going to be Kristen Barcombe presenting on the hidden gems in the ADH World War I collection. Now, all of these programs are free to the public, and our programming is sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives. But Food for Thought 2022 is made possible by a donation in memory of Mike Jenkins IV. So now, let me introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Dr. Ashley Dumas. Dr. Dumas is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of West Alabama, where she also serves as the manager of the Fort Tombecby Archaeological Site. She currently manages the Search for Mabila project, and her primary research focuses on cultural change in the late prehistory and colonial period in the Southeast. So please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Dr. Ashley Dumas.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for being here today. Before I begin, I would like to make a couple of announcements of my own. First of all, if you're here because you think that we've found Mabila, we have not. That's why the title of my presentation is phrased in terms of a gerund. Discovering Mabila. This is an action that's still happening. When you see an announcement for a presentation called Mabila Discovered, that's the one. Secondly, because this presentation is being filmed and is live streamed and it will be available on the YouTube channel of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And because this is an ongoing research project, I would ask that you not take pictures of a sequence of slides, and that you not film this, if you don't mind. This is an ongoing research project, and you'll be out of date soon anyhow. Okay. Right, so Mabila really is a product, in a sense, of some naughty Spaniards. And you're probably familiar with some of these. Most people are familiar with Coronado and Cortez and Pizarro and their exploits in Mesoamerica and in South America, and the allure of gold that made them extraordinarily rich. And it was in these places that Cortez and Coronado and Pizarro honed their skills for brutality against indigenous people. There was a particular captain working for Francisco Pizarro when he conquered the Inca, and his name was Hernando de Soto. De Soto was partially responsible for helping capture the king of the Inca, Atahualpa. He was responsible in the double dealing of the king, and he was certainly directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of indigenous people and indigenous Inca people. What many people outside this room don't often realize is that the Spanish were active in the southeastern portion of North America as well. At the same time that Coronado was entering the southwestern present-day United States from Mexico, the Spaniards were making early 16th century expeditions to the coast. You can see that there were a number of expeditions, the earliest in 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon, and the story of discovery of Florida and the Fountain of Youth. There were not many entradas into the interior. The earliest was by Hernando de Soto, represented on this map, courtesy of John Worth at the University of West Alabama, as a pink line. The next one was Tristan de Luna, who brought shiploads of colonists and supplies to make a permanent settlement, and he's represented here as the dark blue line. And then a little bit later, there was Pedro Menendez de Aviles, who sent someone up the coast of the Atlantic and established several forts along the way, the final one being Fort San Juan or Jawara at a native town. That place has been discovered and is actively being excavated and researched today, as is the site of Santa Elena. So we do know quite a bit about the 16th century Spanish exploration of the southeastern United States. But the other major players in this story, of course, are the indigenous people themselves. And I want to make sure that we understand this less as a story about Soto and more of a story about the people who were here first and had been here for nearly 14,000 years. At this period in the 16th century, we're talking about a culture of people called the Mississippian Indians by archaeologists, but in fact, they were quite diverse. They were, we don't know really what all of them called themselves, but we know that they had a complex system of politics, a complex system of social ranking. They had a very complex and rich religious set of religious beliefs, as well as material culture. The map on the left here is an approximation of where these people lived in the first half of the 15th century, between 1400 and 1450. And as you can see, they were incredibly diverse, they were numerous, they were widespread. Sometimes these groups were allied with one another, often they were not. They spoke a multitude of different languages, and you can't assume that when you move from one section of a river valley to another that they would be necessarily mutually intelligible to all people. As you can see, between 1500 and 1550, there were changes. There were shifts in the political landscape, and by 1550, the effects of the Soto expedition were felt such that in the next 50 years, you'll see a huge reduction in the number of native peoples on the landscape of the southeastern, present-day southeastern United States. This isn't it is a sad story, but it's not a story of total loss or total destruction. And I want to make it clear that these people are among us today. They have a part in this story, and we are very fortunate to have the support of some of them in our research. So going back to this map, let's look specifically at this route of Hernando de Soto. Why is it that we're talking about it? It was the first expedition into the interior of eastern North America. This was it. He was the explorer in this sense. He was the alien invader, the first spaceship to land on the coast and for people to get off and mistreat the human beings who were there. He landed around present-day Tampa Bay in 1539. Moved up through present-day Florida, across present-day Georgia, and ended up in the Appalachian Mountains before heading south again. And this is where we pick up his story, in present-day Alabama. And it's in present-day Alabama where one of the first major losses really occurred. Now, what's remarkable about this story is that we can put this line on the map at all because it was written about. We have two eyewitness accounts and two accounts that were recorded much later. Therefore, some of these are certainly more reliable than others. Perhaps the most reliable is that by Biedma and Rangel, who were there. Rangel himself was the factor, and he was like, I suppose, to stereotype bean counters, very precise, very to the point. He did not embellish, and we have feeling that this is a strongly reliable account. Of course, the one that's the most fun to read is by Garcilaso de la Vega, the Inca. It's the longest. It's probably embellished a bit, but it is taken from eyewitness accounts, though, a number of years after they occurred. These accounts have been carefully translated from the medieval Spanish. So medieval Spanish Spanish, a working knowledge of that is important to do this accurately. And they have been published in 2 volumes by the University of Alabama. Any of you in this audience who are already fans of this story probably have these books and have thumbed through them at least and read portions of the DeSoto Chronicles. They're important because they are eyewitness accounts of Mississippian society. They talk about place names. They're often mispronounced. They're filtered through the Spanish brain and through Spanish language, but they also describe the landscape that was at that time. They describe the density of populations in certain areas. They describe the nature of the leadership. They mention Indian mounds. So this is the first eyewitness account that we have, the first person account that we have of Mississippian populations. Some people like to say that this marks the line between prehistory and history, although we're sort of evolving as archaeologists and ethnohistorians and understanding that to draw that line hard and fast in the sand is not only impractical because the date is going to be different regardless of, depending on where you are. And also it sort of implies that indigenous people didn't have a history before some dirty Spaniard wrote it down. Okay, so the map that you see here is one that you can find on Wikipedia. It was drawn by Herb Rowe, and it's a wonderful map. It's based on the work by Charles Hudson, Chester DePrater, and Marvin Smith as they went through these DeSoto Chronicles very carefully, writing down the place names and the names of people, comparing them with historic maps, the oldest maps they can find, comparing them with modern topographic maps, and also with known archaeological sites, right? So they're using the chronicler's descriptions and of people and places. They're mapping where 16th century Spanish artifacts have been found. This is usually metal because that's what survives in the archaeological record. And they're also, and importantly, looking for 16th century native artifacts. And that's the most abundant artifact associated with the Soto expedition that most of us tend to forget about, right? You're not going to have a Soto site where there was contact between Spaniards and indigenous people if you don't have the right indigenous artifacts. And that's extremely important. And that's why decades and decades of archaeological work have been so incredibly critical to the story that you're hearing today. Okay, so that's the root. The battle of Mabila happened on October 18th, 1540. This is another lovely illustration by Herb Rowe. The battle was significant because after traveling up through the Atlantic states and into the Appalachians and back down into present-day Alabama, DeSoto had nothing to show for it at all. There was no gold. He had some sacks of freshwater pearls that had been given and stolen from a female chief in probably present-day South Carolina, the Lady of Cofita-Checky. And his men were pretty demoralized by this time. These men were expecting a cut of the riches that they found, and they were often financing a large part of their own expeditions. All right, so they wanted to be paid, and not only was it not a payday, but it had become enormously frustrating for members of the Soto expedition. This was not like anything that they had encountered in Mesoamerica or South America, where you had these complex state-level civilizations with real, with bureaucracies and monumental, permanent monumental works representing ideologies of belief and written languages. This is not what they're encountering. Remember the maps that we looked at a few moments ago. These are scattered, independent chiefdoms. They are, if you conquer one, you haven't necessarily done anything to ensure your success over the next hill, right? So there's no head of the snake to grab hold of here and to say you've won, right? So they get to present-day Alabama, and they meet a man named Tascalusa. Tascalusa is legendary. There are a number of folklore. There's really a folklore that's developed around Tascalusa himself. I know one that's a favorite and has even ended up in print is that he was so tall that when the Spaniards put him upon a horse, his feet dragged the ground. Maybe, but I think what's important here is that he was yet another chief who wasn't happy to see that the rumors of the bearded white guys on horses with attack dogs and slaves was true. That these rumors were true. Soto's men had a lot of things to carry, and at every new village they encountered, every village of some size that they encountered, they had two primary demands. Number one, we need burden bearers. We need people to help carry these loads. Some of the army were on horses, right? So there were some cavalry, but there were also a great deal of burdens of food, for instance, weaponry, stock iron, things that would have been necessary for replenishing their equipment that had to be transported. They would, if they were not given porters, they would simply take them and enslave them, often chaining them around the neck as they carried their loads. The other thing that they demanded when they came into Indian villages was food. If they weren't given the food they wanted, the army would spread out into the surrounding countryside around a population center and take the food that they wanted, often in the form of dried maize. And then finally, Soto's army wanted women. They wanted women to satisfy the carnal needs of the men on the journey. And I think this is something that we need to talk about because it's ugly and Soto is not a hero. This was no happy Hernando the way we want to portray him. The Battle of Mabila occurred because Soto was told by Tascalusa that he would not be ordered about, essentially, and this is Dr. Dumas is paraphrasing. He said, "Come to another town that is, part of my chiefdom, part of my purview, and we'll talk there." And so Tascalusa goes ahead. Soto's army is delayed crossing the Alabama River in a town at Piachi, a large Indian town. From Piachi, based on the chronicles, we know that it took 2 days and the morning of the third day to reach the town of Mabila, where Tascalusa had arranged to meet him. When they approach, they note that it is a palisaded town, probably with a wooden palisade wall, similar to what you see here. And this is based on research at other Mississippian sites, archaeological research. The ground around the town had been cleared of any houses or other obstructions, according to the chronicles, much like one might do in preparation for a battle. But when Soto arrived, he was only accompanied by the front guard, essentially the cavalry. Much of the rear guard had been out that morning doing what they always did, scattered into the surrounding countryside, looking for food and porters and etc. Soto decides to enter Mabila to look for Tascalusa and negotiate with him, demand of him what he needed. Tascalusa refused to come out of his cabin. Now, here is where I really editorialize because I think it would make great fodder for that limited series on Netflix. But seriously, Tascalusa was in a large structure, and when Soto sent in an officer to ask him to come out. He refused, and the officer went in and saw that Tascalusa was not alone. He was surrounded by heavily armed and probably pretty angry people. He comes out. He says to Soto, "Doesn't look good," and things grow increasingly tense. Now, according to one of the chronicles, a passing warrior refused to heed the commands of one of Soto's men, and so the soldier grabbed his arm. The warrior jerked his arm away, and so the soldier pulled out his rapier and cut off his arm and his ear on the left side. And this was sort of the spark that lit the tinder that led to the battle. Whatever the precise circumstances were, we know that the town was set ablaze. In that fire, everything was lost. And I don't mean just the Indian homes and Indian corn and lives, but all of Soto's supplies were lost. Everything. They had gone in with the front guard, with the priests, with the communion set, with the pearls, with things that were most important to them, while the rank and file were out scavenging for food. They did eventually catch up to this, and there was a raging battle. It lasted all day. The advantage of having horses and crossbows was certainly a good one for Soto. There are estimates of between 2,000 to as many as 6,000 Native people were killed that day. There were a few dozen casualties on the Spanish side, including injuries. The Spanish stayed there or nearby for around a month, basically regrouping. And Soto had a choice to make. He knew that there were resupply ships on the coast, on the northern Gulf Coast. And he had a choice to either head south and meet those resupply ships and risk having his men mutiny and never getting them back on the trail, or continuing on toward on the way toward exploration. And so he chose to keep going. He headed northwest from there, according to the chronicles. Why do we talk about the Battle of Mabila apart from its Netflix limited series possibilities? The Battle of Mabila, I think it's not hyperbole to say, is one of those events in history where we can point our finger and say, that's why things are not vastly different than they are today. For instance, that's why we're not speaking Spanish today. This is a turning point in the colonization of the eastern United States. It's certainly a turning point for the Spanish. The Spanish did not go back into the interior for 20 years, and when they did, it was not a happy time. This was the end, incidentally, of this type of brutality to Native peoples. It's not working. Chaining people at the neck, beating them, taking them as slaves. By this time, the teachings, the philosophy of one Franciscan priest named Bartolome de las Casas had been taking root. And he was a man who said, these indigenous people might be human and they might have souls worth saving and having on our sides. This was beginning to take root at this time. So the Soto expedition was a turning point in strategy for colonization. It was a turning point in the success, certainly, of the expedition. Everything was sort of downhill from here, and by the time they get to the Mississippi River, Soto takes ill and dies. His expedition ends up straggling back into Mexico via a water route. There's been a lot of work on this prior to my involvement and prior to the current team's involvement. If you want to know about why that Indian pottery of the 16th century is especially important, then the book on the right is for you. This was a this book came out of a doctoral dissertation, and we reference it quite a bit for understanding what kind of Indian pottery we need to be looking for on the landscape. The book in the middle by Charles Hudson, this is something written for the general public. It's a wonderful read. I highly recommend it. And the book on the left was an edited volume published out of the last major attempt to look for Soto in Central Alabama. It was edited by Jim Knight, who's now emeritus of the University of Alabama and a current member of the present day team. And in this book, you will see the results of scholarship when you include a diverse set of perspectives. You have geologists, geographers, archaeologists, ethnoarchaeologists, ethnohistorians, linguists, right? And old and young came together for several days in 2005, I think. And this book was the result of that. It is still relevant, although it doesn't have a conclusive look here on the map for Soto. This was a good place to start if you're brand new to the search for Mabila. And it's on all of these people's shoulders that we're standing today in order to make progress. So if you're looking for Mabila, what do you need? Well, we know that it was a 3-day march from Piache, or 2 days in the morning of the 3rd. Okay. And a 30-day march to the next major Indian settlement called Chicaza, where the Spaniards got into trouble again. Okay, how do you estimate how far an army of this size, 600, with burden bearers in chains, on foot, can go? This has probably this is where you're going to find a lot of disagreement among people. How far can these people go in a day? Well, I remember on a University of Anthropology, University of Alabama Anthropology Club field trip, we followed a crazy guy I ended up marrying on a hike through the Bankhead Forest. And we were not in chains. We were a little dehydrated. And at the end of the day, at dusk, when we arrived back at our campsite, we'd gone all of 13 miles. That's about right, right? Anything beyond about 15 miles is going to be much too far. It's just not feasible for an army of this size, considering that most of them are on foot and are carrying heavy loads, not to mention tired and sick and stinky. If we go with 12 to 13 miles a day, this is going to give us some radii to work with, right? Mabila is described as being on a plain. Perhaps with a nearby pond. There was some mention of some pond-like feature with blood in it after the battle. There is no mention of a major river being anywhere near Mabila. There is no mention of a mound associated with the site. This is significant. It's significant for a couple of reasons. These are the types of landmarks and features that the Spaniards had noted in the earlier portions of the Chronicles. So one would expect them to note this type of thing at this point, or you could assume. It's also significant because we're talking about Mississippian culture. And in Mississippian culture, the underpinning of the entire culture, of the entire economy, was maize agriculture. These people were corn farmers. This was what they did. And if you look at think back to those maps, many of those chiefdoms are centered around major river valleys, where you have rich alluvial soil that tends to be well drained, right? This is where these people were known to live. And this is where, logically, archaeologists had been looking for decades and decades. That's not what they say about Mabila. It's on a plain. There should be large and dense concentrations of burned daub. Daub is simply the mixture of clay and perhaps grass or other vegetable matter that would be used to close up, to seal up the walls of a Mississippian house. It's clay, so when it burns, it hardens into a ceramic or brick-like structure. If you find Mabila archaeologically, it's going to be obvious. One of my favorite quotes from Greg Wazelkoff, a mentor and colleague and friend of mine, is that, okay, you found Mabila, great. It's going to be obvious. You're going to have a town-sized area of burned daub. You're going to have Indian pottery, more or less households of material goods in place by the hundreds. There's going to be a tremendous amount of metal. Not everything can be scavenged without a metal detector. And let me tell you, even with a metal detector, an experienced metal detectorist, you have to go back to a site numerous times to find all of the metal. So it's not going to be a guessing game. We don't have to look at an archaeological site and say, maybe, right? That's the good news, okay? The other thing you're going to find with Mabila is 16th century Spanish artifacts, including items of warfare, crossbow bolts, pieces of crossbows, halberd tips, all of these sorts of things that would have been on the army meant for killing. And that 16th century pottery of the correct age and other artifacts. All right, returning to this route. Yeah. So here's the route. We have 2 question marks on here. One of them is located near the Alabama River, and the other green dot is located at the forks of the Tombigbee and Alabama River. And historically, these are the 2 places where scholars have been looking. The reason people have been looking in the forks of the Alabama and Tombigbee rivers is a good one. And that reason is that there was a cache of 16th century Spanish artifacts found in a mound in that region. They date to the right period. Is that Mabila? Is Mabila nearby? That's the question. And there are people actively researching this area to help answer that question. There's a lot of good scholarship there. But we can't forget about the Luna expedition and the Luna colony. Luna's ships were wrecked in Pensacola Bay. They've been discovered by archaeologists at the University of West Florida. And a few years ago, the remnants of the Luna expedition were found on the shores of Pensacola Bay by John Worth and his associates and students from the University of West Alabama. So we know what artifacts of this period look like. The problem is that Luna himself, and several hundred people left that colony there on Pensacola Bay because they were getting hungry. It's like these people had never had to feed themselves ever, right? The only first option always seems to be Indian corn. In any case, there are ships sent up the rivers into Alabama, including the Tombigbee and the Alabama rivers. Now, these ships would have been seen, right? So from 1559 to 1561, there would be Spanish goods on these boats going into the interior. 1559 is just 20 years after the beginning of the DeSoto expedition. There's not going to be any difference visibly in style and technology between Luna artifacts and DeSoto artifacts. But then a few years ago, researchers from the University of South Carolina, the Florida Museum of Natural History, and the University of Mississippi, now at Mississippi State, working with the Chicaza Indians, began finding Spanish metal in the area of present-day Starkville, Mississippi. they located dozens and dozens of little sites. Every one of these dots here represents one or two little farmsteads, Mississippian farmsteads. And amongst these farmsteads are objects like the ones you see on the right. These are 16th century artifacts. These are the Chickasaw people, Chicaza. This is the location of the Chickasaw province. This is where Soto went after Mabila. And there's no doubt that that's what these artifacts are from. It's nowhere near the lower Tombigbee or the Alabama rivers. So we can now put a dot on the map for Chicaza. We know that Chicaza was a 30-day march from Mabila. We also know that before Mabila, Soto and his men crossed the Alabama River at a high, craggy bluff at the town of Piachi. Now, a high, craggy bluff on the Alabama River in this region means a big, white chalk bluff. There are 5 possibilities. If you'd like to put a dot on any one of those 5 possibilities and multiply 12 to 13 miles by 2.3 days, you end up somewhere within these triangles. And from somewhere in those triangles, you can do the same math and end up in about 30 days at Starkville. In describing Chicaza, it was a very populous and fertile land. There were some large enclosed towns and a considerable population scattered about over the field, the houses being separated from one another by 1 or 2 crossbow flights. Excuse me, that's the description of Mabila, the Mabila province. 1 or 2 crossbow flights. Again, this is something that's easily estimated. 1 or 2 crossbow flights from one house to another is about shouting distance to mama, right? And I say that with some humor, but I mean it quite seriously because these Mississippian people were matrilineal. That means that they traced their ancestry through their mothers. They stayed close to their mother's people. Yes, it was difficult to be a man in a matrilineal society, right? So the houses would have been mama's house, perhaps aunt's house, grandma's house, scattered over the landscape. Chicaza was well-peopled as well, the population being spread out, as was that of Mabila. So in the fall of 2019, we began looking in agricultural fields. Why? Because it's easy. You don't have to dig. And we began walking in agricultural fields that were owned by a man who'd invited a bunch of us out to his property to look for Mabila. I think that I was invited because I lived in Greensboro for around 13 years and just knew a lot of the people around there. I thought that I could go my entire career without getting sucked into Soto or Mabila. Never say never, right? So one afternoon we walked out into a dove field and we started picking up pottery that looked about the right age. Now, this wasn't completely unknown, not completely unexpected, because Jim Knight and a student of his had done a small survey in the area and had found shell-tempered pottery. That just means pottery made with clay and crushed up freshwater mussel shell. Very, very specific to this period of time. And we wanted to know if there was more. And so we walked and walked and walked and walked. And when I say we, I mean volunteers, some of whom are sitting here in the audience. I mean University of West Alabama students. And we covered, since 2019, we've covered around a little over 5,000 acres And boy, have we found the pottery. We find the pottery in small clusters about the size of a household, what you might expect for a household or an extended household. They're within about shouting distance of each other. Some of them are clustered in, say, dozens that may represent small villages, and all of it is 16th century. Well, that's fine. We're looking for October 18th, 1540. And that's where the rub is. And that's where we're going to be having some lively discussions over beer at the Southeastern Archaeological Conference in early November. But I have more evidence. Here's what the pottery looks like when you find it and it hasn't been broken up completely by the plow. Here's what daub looks like when you're getting it out of the Black Prairie. The Black Prairie is underlain by that white chalk, and it's inevitably kind of present in all of the clay there. And this is what it looks like. This is what daub looks like when it's burned. We have not found a field of daub yet. We did not set out thinking that we would find the battle site of Mabila. We set out to see if we had 16th century pottery of the right age. Is there a settlement? Is there a series of settlements that could qualify as the province of Mabila, as something that Tascalusa had talked about having purview over? Is there anything like that, of that size in this area? Or is this another place we can just scratch off the map, right? We certainly didn't set out and expect to find things like this. This is a piece of iron. It is 16th century iron, and it has been worn down on the tip to be used as a chisel or an adze. And we sure as heck didn't set out to find lots of it. These are possible barrel band straps, the straps that go around barrels, although we're debating now about what else they could have been. All of these pieces are about 10 centimeters long. They're about a centimeter or less thick, and they've all been worn down on one end because they've been made to be used by native peoples as chisels or adzes, and they look exactly like the ones that come from known DeSoto sites in Florida and Georgia. They look a lot like other artifacts that we know come from, they look exactly like other artifacts we know come from 16th century sites. We're beginning to suspect that these are part of gift kits, that the Spanish figured out pretty quickly what these people wanted, what they wanted to use it for, and began assisting in transforming their own material into something that they could trade with. Here's some other pieces. And here are the horseshoes. We've now tripled the number of 16th century Spanish horseshoes ever found in the southeastern U.S. These are horseshoes. They're very distinctive. They do not look like modern horseshoes or mule shoes at all. They are completely flat. They're very thin. The holes they don't have that ferrule, that groove that you'll see at the around the outside edge of modern horseshoes. They have square holes, and these too have been broken. Some of these actually show bend breaks, and they've been repurposed on at least one end to be used as a chisel or an adze or some other type of tool, scraping device even. This second one here, letter B, is probably one of my favorites, not only because my 11-year-old son found it, but because it looks as if it's been used as a tool, but has also been worn around the neck like a pendant. They look just like the horseshoes found at Santa Elena on the Atlantic coast, from a known 16th century site in Georgia, and from 16th century horseshoes from Cuba, for that matter. So this slide is courtesy of Charlie Cobb, our other partner who's at the base of the Florida Museum of Natural History. And he put the locations of all known horseshoes on the map. For what it's worth, it matches up pretty well with the Soto route proposed by Charles Hudson. It also overlaps some with the Luna route, and that's something that we really need to keep in mind. I talk about Luna in this presentation, unlike I've spoken about him in other presentations on this research, because we're constantly accumulating more information. All of the individuals involved in this research met for 2 days in August just to brainstorm and think about best explanations for all of the data that we have. And we think that it is likely that some of this metal did come from the Luna expedition. But certainly much of it did not. And one way that we're going to find out for sure is that these pieces are being examined with a laser. It's called X-ray fluorescence, and it just measures the precise amount of each of the minerals in the iron. That can be compared, and if the metal is coming from one place or another, it's going to show differences or similarities, basically a metal recipe. We know that the Soto expedition was supplied primarily from Seville, and much of the Luna expedition was supplied primarily from existing suppliers in Mexico. So these pieces are going to look metallurgically different, and that project is underway right now. We're also finding odd pieces like this. There's a hunk of lead. B and C, if you say to me, look, I grew up on a farm, I see that kind of stuff associated with mule and plow, tractor parts all the time. I'm going to say, yeah, you're right. And we find a lot of 19th century and early 20th century farm material. It is not easy to distinguish in some cases. Again, that's why we have to turn to the hard sciences and do these metallurgical analyses. The piece on the right, though, as soon as that came out of the ground, we knew we had something really special. This is one of those like goosebump moments that I'm pretty skeptical of, but I had one here. That's a tiny little piece of brass. It's very thin, and it matches perfectly with the base of one of these 16th century candlesticks. Yeah. In June, we had expert metal detectorists come to one of our sites, the site where we initially found this piece. They re-metal detected the whole thing, and we now have several dozen pieces of brass. That too is undergoing XRF analysis. In all, we found over 200 individual farmstead sites. They cluster into 4 groups. They are not anywhere near a major river valley. They are in the uplands of the prairie. In fact, they're near water sources that don't flow year-round necessarily. You might have to dig into the bottom of that stream bed to get some water. So of these nearly 200 sites, we have metal detected only 7. And we have 100 pieces of confirmed 16th century Spanish metal out of only 7 sites of the 200 we found. So we have a lot of work to do, and we feel with absolute confidence that we are in the province of Mabila. Getting this stuff off of the surface of an agricultural field is one thing, but excavating it yourself is another. We've had a lot of help from people who were formerly at the University of Mississippi come in and do some geophysical work for us. This basically just helps us see beneath the surface without digging. And we've been able to excavate at 3 of these sites to recover pottery in context, right? Also coming out of these excavations are radiocarbon dates. And those radiocarbon dates, this is from last year. We now have an additional probably 50 samples, of which 25 we're going to focus on first. All show mid-16th century. The dates look good. So going back to our list of evidence for Mabila, 3-day march from Piace. If you think you can go further than 13 miles with a burden and a chain around your neck, well, draw your lines elsewhere. But I think we're a 3-day march from Piace. I think we're a 30-day march to Chicaza. And it's really not what I think. This is all feasible and verifiable. Are we on a plain, perhaps, with a nearby pond? There are beaver ponds in this area. There is no major river. Large, dense concentrations of burned daub? Nope. 16th century Spanish artifacts? Yes, but no items of warfare yet. 16th century native artifacts of the right age? Absolutely. We have the province of Mabila. That's why the title of my presentation is Discovering Mabila. I feel, let me back up. I think that we are within a mile and a half of the battle site itself. It comes down to permission from landowners and time, right? None of this could have been done without the work of volunteers. Linda Derry, Teresa Paglione, Randy Cottier. There you are. I was trying to make eye contact with her. Randy Cottier. A number of students. And I want to emphasize here that while we work with big SEC names like, University of Mississippi, Mississippi State, University of Alabama, University of Florida, this is a project led by the University of West Alabama, and the students involved in this are Black Belt students. Many of them are first-generation students. They didn't know what anthropology was when they started, and that's probably one of the proudest personal achievements of this project, is that it is student-led. It is a Black Belt project led by a Black Belt university and Black Belt students, and I am grateful to have them. The project leaders include myself, Charlie Cobb, Jim Knight. Nothing like this is ever done by yourself, and really you can't do it with a small team of big brains. It requires a lot of big brains, and we are fortunate to have those people. And finally, the project has operated, except for a grant from the Winter Grand Anthropological Foundation, it's operated largely on private funds. We do write grants, and we are in the process of writing grants. That's how it should work. On the other hand, we've had donations from people who are just fans of this story, and we have people who just want to see it found before they pass on into the next world. And the private funds allow us to move quickly and with fewer strings attached, right? We can move fast. We can get the results that we want from the specialized analyses we want very quickly. I didn't start out doing this and ending a presentation by asking for funds, but I'm not shy about it now because I can see what those funds yield. So if you're so inclined, here's how to donate. And then really and truly finally, all of this is dependent on the cooperation of the landowners and the farmers. You'll notice that none of my maps have specific identifying information. That's not just to protect the site or because I have some selfish motives in, getting like first grab on this stuff. It's because I can't do this unless my landowners and farmers can trust that we will protect their privacy and protect their land. And so we're really grateful to them as well. And thank you all for coming today.
Does it work? There we go. We do have some time for questions. And if you are one of our online audience members, you can submit it and I'll get it through my phone. But we have our first question right here.
Approximately how many people were on the Hernando de Soto expedition? And also how many horses can you estimate with that?
There were around 600 people on the expedition. For the number of horses, I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but I'm thinking around 200, but don't quote me on that. I've no doubt really that there are people in this room who know these figures more specifically than I do. I have it in my notebook here, but I doubt you want to wait for me to look it up. Yeah, 600. And of course, the famous herd of pigs. Yeah.
I've certainly enjoyed your presentation, but why was it the worst skirmish of his entire march happened when he met Chief Tascalusa?
Well, I don't know that we, why was it the worst skirmish? I don't know. I guess you would know as well as I would. I know that they fought back, and one problem, of course, was the fire. The fire is what ultimately caused the loss of all of the supplies and a lot of the anything that they had to show for their efforts. But these people were fighting for their homes and fighting for their land. And by this time, I've no doubt that they had heard of what was coming up the road. They didn't want to be enslaved, right? They didn't want to be mistreated. That may not be where you were going with your question, but that's my opinion in any case.
Oh, well, also exactly about what kind of pieces are you looking for as well? Are you looking for additional armor as well? Some
Yeah,
bullets?
we need to, finding implements of warfare, finding evidence, direct evidence of the battle itself is going to involve finding pieces of armor, chainmail, crossbow bolts, crossbow tips, those sorts of things. And we do not have any of that yet. Right.
Also, so during the whole expedition, do you believe this southern battle laid down the foundations for Spain losing interest in the lands of modern-day southeastern part of the United States? And also, do you believe that could they find another way without fighting and get those supplies?
Yeah, so it was only 20 years later that Tristan da Luna set out with several ships loaded with colonists, right, with the intent of colonizing the coastline. And I've no doubt that from there they intended to move into the interior. But this was the Battle of Mabila demonstrated that it was not going to be easy and that all could be lost in a few hours' time. It's not like they could have gone back and salvaged out, a bunch of melted gold that had been burned up in the conflagration. There was none of that, and they did not find what they were looking for in the expedition to that point, and it didn't get any better. Yeah. Yes.
This will be our last question.
I know in certain areas where the Spanish went, like in what is now Mexico, there was slavery among the Indians before the Spanish came.
Yes.
Was that the case in the area we're talking about now?
Enslavement of people varied. Yes, there was indigenous slavery as part of warfare and conflict. In some societies, based on ethno-historic evidence, we can see, and really pottery evidence as well, it seems that in some places, slaves taken in battle would be incorporated, particularly women and children would be incorporated into a society. In other cases, they would be incorporated but not be full members of a society. So slavery is a nuanced institution, right? It's not the same everywhere. And it's clear that that no one wants to be enslaved by a complete outsider. That kind of treatment, that kind of brutality, concubinage, enslavement, with chains at the neck. That's a different thing than taking a slave in warfare. These were demanded and stolen people, And I will say, too, that what we see happening after the Soto Entrada is certainly there's a dying off due to disease, but there's a survival strategy that sort of reflects this, us, them, right? When you're under attack like that, the differences you have with the people around you become much smaller when there's an outsider. And post-Soto, we see a revitalization of really fundamental religious beliefs and practices and ideas. It's reflected on the material culture, the pottery particularly, because we know that's what survives, right? So that's something that we see happening immediately post-Soto. We might even be seeing that in some of the farmsteads that we found. I think a lot of them date to just after the Soto Entrada, and we're sort of finding the results of how people responded to that. And they come together, they coalesce in anthropological terms. Yeah. Focus on what they have in common. Yep.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Dumas for her time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope to see all of you here again next Tuesday, October 25th for Alabama Radio Moments, and also next month for our Food for Thought, November 17th, as Joby Hill will present Architecture of the Enslaved, documenting Alabama's slave houses. Thank y'all.
If you want to see some of the artifacts, I have them here.
Oh, yes. For our in-person audience, we have some artifacts up the front for you to see.